Very much for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many of you, and for what is going to be an excellent talk that I'm really excited to listen to. So thank you, Georgia, for agreeing to come along tonight, and after unfortunately having been ill a couple of weeks ago, being able to come along tonight, we really appreciate it. So the format of the talk is as normal. Georgia will have about approximately 45 minutes or so talk, and then there'll be plenty of room for questions after that, and you can put questions in the chat if you want to, or you can come in on the mic and ask the questions that way, whichever you prefer. So without any further ado, I'll just introduce our speaker tonight. So Georgia Vullinghs is the curator of modern and contemporary Scottish history at the National Museums of Scotland. Her talk today is based on her PhD research, which she completed with the University of Edinburgh in collaboration with NMS, on the material and visual culture of Jacobite exile from circa 1716 to 1760. And I will let Georgia share her screen and hand over to her now.
Thank you, Nicola. And thank you for inviting me, and apologies about having to reschedule the other day, but feeling much better. Here we go. I'll just open this PowerPoint properly. So yeah, as Nicola said, today I thought I would lead you through some of the outcomes of my PhD thesis, highlighting a few of the favourite objects and images and the human responses to them that I encountered through the research. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Jacobite history and Jacobite material culture. But for me, the title of this project ultimately prompted me to think about that culture in terms of three key themes: loyalty, exchange, and exile. And I think looking at the material culture of Jacobitism with this framework has given more life not just to the objects themselves, but to the cause they were part of, and I hope you'll agree, has brought something new to the field in some way. So for those of you who are a bit less familiar, the Jacobites were the supporters of the branch of the Stuart royal dynasty that in 1689 lost the crown. So James VII and II of Scotland and England, and his descendants, his son, the would-be Prince of Wales, and the Jacobite King James VIII, and then in turn his sons, Charles Edward Stewart, possibly better known to you as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and Prince Henry Benedict Stewart. Another important figure for today is the Jacobite Queen, wife of James VIII and mother of Charles and Henry, Maria Clementina Sobieska. So I'm not going to go into lengthy detail about the why and how of the second Stuart exile of the 17th century, but the Catholicism of James VII and the threat of prolonging Catholic rule that the arrival of a male heir presented in 1688 played an important role. And then ongoing support for the Stuarts had, as ever, religious preference, political goals, foreign diplomacy, and opportunity at its centre. Alongside, for many, a genuine belief not just in the divine right of kings, but real love for the Stuart dynasty and family as the rightful monarchs. From the late 17th to the mid-18th century, there were several plots and realised military attempts to restore the lineage of James VII to the thrones of England, Scotland and Ireland, 1715 and 1745 being two significant ones. So as I hope you'll understand by the end of this talk today, loyalty was experienced as much as an emotion acted out through interaction with objects as it was through actions on the battlefield. Taking the sentiment of loyalty seriously, rather than emphasising whether its goals were achieved or measuring them against achievable outcomes, is important when we consider the reality that the Stuarts and their Jacobites experienced. For me, commitment to the idea of the Stuarts as the true royal lineage is a sufficient distinction of Jacobitism. Material and visual culture was central to realising that commitment for both the exiled Stuarts themselves and their supporters at home and abroad. So we will have noted that my time period starts some decades after James and his family were first found refuge in France in 1689. This time period focuses attention on the court of James VIII and III as it moved, some might say, was pushed further from British shores, first to the south of France and Avignon, then to Urbino in the Italian states, and finally finding a permanent home, although this is not what they would have sought, in Rome. And this is also the period which sees the Stuart dynasty set against the Hanoverian dynasty, who came to the British throne in 1714, and as such should be seen, I think, as a new phase of Jacobitism. And indeed, the way in which these two families interacted and the relationship between the material culture that they both produced certainly deserves more comparative attention for this particular period, which I didn't succeed in doing, but would love to pursue, or for someone to take that on. So, living on the continent, the Stuart dynasty was an exiled one. The idea of exile was central to the ideology and experience of Jacobitism by the early 18th century. The primary aim of the Jacobites was to see a return of the hereditary successor of James VII and II to British soil as ruling monarchs. But simultaneously, Jacobitism was inextricably linked to the absence of the Stuarts. As Edward Said has said of exile, it is not that love and home are lost, but that loss is inherent in the very existence of both. Jacobitism and its potency relied on the physical exile of the Stuarts, with some of their supporters alongside them, for its existence. But they were not the only exiles. As Catherine King has found in the Jacobite novels of Jane Barker, who lived 1652 to 1732, the, quote, pro-Stuart subject in a post-Stuart kingdom experienced feelings of not belonging, alienation, estrangement, so feelings that they held in common with their exiled counterparts beyond Britain's borders. And Daniel Secchi has termed these two types of Jacobitism, two terms of Jacobite exile as the material and the spiritual diaspora. So ultimately, Jacobitism is characterized by the desire of the exile to return home physically and ideologically. In King's words, the longing to see a torn existence patched together into an imagined whole. So this is where this topic of exile, I think, becomes really important in Jacobitism. Various scholars have explored how exiles used culture to deal with and master their displacement. An important understanding that comes out of Jacobite material culture when we look at it from the point of view of exile is the extent to which culture played an important role for the Stuarts and their supporters in coping with exile. Like other exiles, Jacobites, including the Stuarts themselves, used material and visual culture to, again, quote Said, reconstitute a new world that somewhat resembles an old one left behind forever. As my examples will show, underpinning Jacobitism was the notion that the Stuarts, by their inherited bloodline, were innately superior to the dynasty that had replaced them, yet they required to maintain the correct material presence to manifest that claim in the first place. And then in Britain, the production, consumption, and exchange of material and visual culture helped loyal Jacobites to contend with the absence of the Stuarts, to navigate the reality of their existence in early Georgian Britain. And in many ways, I think the material and visual culture of Jacobite exile says as much about presence and ability to belong as it says about a need to respond to absence and exclusion. I went a slide too early, sorry. Let's pause for a moment to think about what I mean by material and visual culture. So material culture refers to a broad range of objects, but is generally defined as those which have been made and manipulated by humans, including naturally occurring things like hair. The most explicitly Jacobite are those extant artefacts which carry pro-Stuart messages, usually signified through iconography or words on the object. As Vicky Coltman has stated, there is, quote, a distinct body of material which is recognisably Jacobite in its content and intent. This body includes medals circulated by the exiled court, glassware engraved with Jacobite symbols, printed fans, woven garters, ceramics and jewellery. It encompasses objects and images which are coded, yet through knowledge and understanding of Jacobite culture have become intelligible. The range of undetected examples of Jacobite artefacts which may exist is testament to the success of the concealment which necessarily surrounded them. Images of the exiled Stuarts in the form of miniature portraits, printed engravings, and incorporated in and on objects such as jewellery or snuff boxes are also explicitly Jacobite. As an oft-quoted 1725 pamphlet stated, those who set up the picture of the pretender would set him upon the throne if it were in their power. The circulation of Stuart portraits was central to the Jacobite ideology of hereditary right and in promoting the legitimacy of James VIII and his descendants. And in response, the viewer was expected to instantly recognise and feel loyalty towards the sitter in the portrait. I'm certainly not the first, nor I hope the last, to study Jacobite material culture. Material and visual culture has already been used as a valuable source for evidence for the history of Jacobitism, its ideology, its goals, and on a simple level, uncovering its historical existence. Studying Jacobite culture has enhanced our understanding of the experience of support for the exiled Stuarts during the 18th century, and it has moved Jacobitism beyond the parliamentary, military, and ecclesiastical domains which dominated the history. Examining the culture of Jacobitism provides different kinds of evidence to explain loyalty to the Stuarts and expands the field of participation in Jacobitism and expressions of Jacobitism to include literature, associational activities such as drinking clubs, and private reflection by individuals. What I would like to do is emphasise the material and the sensual engagement with objects and the images that they carry as things made, used, and exchanged. And thinking about how this was imperative to the function of the visual and material culture of Jacobite exile. So with that rather extended introduction, I'll take you through a few key examples which I think bring out those themes best in my thesis. And these look both at the Stuart court in Rome, their supporters in Britain, and try to make connections between the two. So, as Catholic claimant to the crowns of England, Scotland and Ireland, James VIII was welcomed by elite Roman society as de jure monarch. The move to Rome of the court coincided with James's marriage in 1719 to this Polish princess, Maria Clementina Sobieska, who also happened to be goddaughter to the Pope. So with a queen and therefore expectant of heirs, and provided with appropriate accommodation, from September 1719, the Jacobites had a complete royal court in exile. The building, then called the Palazzo del Re, still stands today, and it was large enough to house separate apartments for a king, queen, and would-be princes. However, most of the courtiers themselves were required to find their own accommodation in Rome. When the rent was taken up by the papacy on James's behalf, it was intended as a temporary measure. The Jacobites and their supporters still hoped for a restoration through a Spanish-supported invasion attempt planned for the summer of 1719. But ultimately, the Palazzo became the permanent residence of the Stuarts in Rome for 60 years, until the death of Charles Edward Stuart in January 1788. And Edward Corp really has done a lot of work on the site of the Stuart court in Rome and its makeup, and so I won't talk much about that today. The material culture of the exiled court is very relevant to the history of Jacobitism. With these objects, items of clothing and jewellery, for example, while they're not intrinsically Jacobite, their use by the Stuarts was always in the construction of an image that served the cause. And through the archival and physical record, as well as building on the work of Corp, I wanted to consider the sartorial culture of the Stuarts and how they fashioned themselves as royal. I also wanted to situate the court's material and visual culture in the broader context of early modern monarchy. I don't dispute that the exiled Stuarts were presented with a unique position, and maintaining an appropriate appearance was imperative to sustaining not just support for their cause, but also their whole being as royals. However, in this concerted effort to be seen as legitimate monarchs, they present a useful case study for understanding the expectations and ideals of early modern court culture. The portraits of the Stuarts provide valuable evidence of how they dressed in Rome. So cautiously accepting some truth in these images, they demonstrate that the Stuarts' wardrobe was full of sumptuous clothing, colourful fabrics, decorated with gold embroidery encrusted with jewels. Eyewitness accounts reveal that these clothes were not entirely of the artist's imagining, created as propaganda. And we have to think of this in the context of the British Grand Tour to Rome. So they were seen in the city, and the accounts that I have read of the Stuarts by tourists reporting back to family and friends in Britain in no way suggest that the Stuarts were out of place in Roman society in terms of how they dressed and presented themselves. The account books of the Stuart court further substantiate the pictorial evidence. Those which are most accessible are full of payments for new gloves and shoes on a monthly basis, as well as materials such as velvet, silks, lace, taffeta, Indian cotton, and gold and silver embroidered accessories. So overall, the clothing of the court aligned with other European court fashions of the period, placing the Stuarts amongst their fellow monarchs. An inventory from 1742 of Prince Charles's jewels deposited at Monte de Pieta, a public moneylender or pawnbroker, describes some of these jewels that they wore. The list is replete with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and pearls in the form of crosses, rings, pins, and pendants. Clementina had a generous dowry of jewels, as well as her own personal possessions, while her sons inherited a collection of jewels to the value of 100,000 Roman crowns from their Polish grandfather. So, adorning the bodies of the exiled royal family, jewels displayed their magnificence. But these were not just sparkly things. When looking at a list of objects gifted to Clementina on her arrival to the court as the new Stuart queen, I was interested to see what had been selected as her inheritance from her predecessor, Mary of Modena. The dowager queen had died only months before the marriage agreement between James and Clementina was reached. And the inventory of jewels and portraits sent from amongst Mary of Modena's possessions at Saint-Germain-en-Laye to James in 1718-19 identifies specific items which were given to Clementina on her arrival. The heading of the list, which details pieces taken out of the King's strongbox by Mr. Murray for the Queen, suggests that these objects were chosen for her by James Murray, the Earl of Dunbar. And in James VIII's absence, he'd gone with the intention of going to Scotland to stage another rising, which was unsuccessful. Murray had been appointed proxy of the marriage and took charge of the court and the Queen's welcome at Rome. His actions are an example of the way senior courtiers and others around the monarch assisted with and at times directed the process of self-fashioning. These gifted items helped Clementina to assimilate into her new role as James's wife and consort of the Stuart dynasty, but they also contained the expectations that Murray had for his new queen. So apologies, I don't have images of these items, I've only read about them in the inventories, but the ones that were chosen included 2 lockets containing a portrait of James when he was young, one containing a portrait of his deceased sister, the Princess Louise Marie, a medal of the royal siblings, several miniature portraits of her new husband at different ages, a few other miniatures of Louise, and a ruby in the shape of a heart. The heart-shaped ruby and the portraits of James might have been intended as a gesture of love from her absent husband, with which Clementina could come to know him and in turn display her affection. With possession of the portraits of Louise, Clementina was included in the extended familial networks emotionally connected to her deceased sister-in-law. The new queen was also presented with miniature portraits of her inherited Stuart ancestors, not only James's father, but Charles I, James VI, and Mary Queen of Scots. These portraits helped Clementina to come to know the illustrious Stuart lineage that she joined through marriage and which would endure in her children. The portraits of Mary Queen of Scots, Charles I, and the exiled James VII in particular relate to a wider Jacobite culture of remembrance of Catholic Stuart martyrs who stood as examples to the newer Stuart queen in exile. Alongside these smaller objects, Clementina inherited Mary of Modena's gilt toilette set, which both assisted Clementina in her display of magnificence and during the rituals of dressing, connected her with the late queen. Furthermore, she inherited Mary's rich prie-dieu, as it was described, a gesture towards their shared faith and a sign of expectation that Clementina would likewise inherit in and embrace the role of devotional exemplar to her people. Overall, the selection of objects given to Clementina from amongst Mary Modena's possessions not only welcomed the young princess into the Stuart family on her marriage, but represented a material transfer of queenship to the new consort. And these objects moulded Clementina as a Stuart queen and secured her membership in that lineage. The accounts suggest also that on occasion efforts were made to engage with specifically English forms of material culture in the self-fashioning of the exiled Stuarts. Accounts for February 1719 list 2 English silver snuff boxes, and for May 1720, a gold snuff box for the Queen, double, so meaning with 2 compartments, and English. In February 1721, they ordered English gold double cased watch and chain. So making these Anglo-centric purchases enhance the Stuart king and queen's relationship with the country from which they were excluded. As consumers of English products, the Stuarts shared the tastes of those they claimed to represent and contributed to supporting English manufacturing as patriotic monarchs. On another occasion, when Clementina thought she was pregnant in 1728, preparations were made by Winifred Maxwell, Countess of Nithsdale, for clothing the expected child. Writing to a Mrs. Raffa or Rassa, I can't quite make it out in the text in the letter, who this woman had made both Charles and Henry's infant clothing. Lady Nithsdale said that she would send over the suit that came from England to be a pattern to you. A suit of Charles' clothing seems to have been sent from England and would therefore be expected to be in a particularly English style, from which more dress for the infant was to be copied and made in Rome. As James wrote to the Duke of Ormond, his envoy in Spain, after the birth of Charles in December 1720, the brave and burly prince would be dressed and looked after as much as the climate will allow in the English way, for though I cannot help his being born in Italy, yet as much as in me lies, he shall be English for the rest all over. So he's saying that although this prince and any subsequent princes were born in Italy, the court aimed to raise the Stuart heirs as identifiably English princes, and their dress played a significant role in those efforts. Language too was a signifier of the prince's Englishness, and in November 1722, James was pleased to report to one of his supporters, Anne Oglethorpe, an English Jacobite, that his 2-year-old son understands everything one says in English, which I hope I shall compass to have him taught to speak without any foreign accent. So within their sartorial display of cosmopolitan and monarchical magnificence, living in Rome, the Stuarts were conscious to inject their self-fashioning with material culture identifiable as English and to a lesser extent Scottish, to maintain their appearance as claimants to the triple British crowns. Now, while they lacked jewels, they had many jewels, apologies, as a symbol of monarchy, they lacked regalia, formal regalia. But one piece that they did have in exile and appear to have added to while they were there were the jewels of the noble orders of England and Scotland, so the orders of the Garter and the Thistle. So these ostensibly English chivalric orders were used by the Stuarts to identify themselves as the legitimate British royal dynasty. These have also been extensively discussed by others, so I won't go too far into it, but it's fair to say that these were worn in person and are visible in the portraits of the royal Stuarts, a key element of their iconography. So the blue sash and the badge of the Garter, and in this picture of Charles on the left, you can just see the greener sash of the Thistle and hanging at his chest, St. Andrew's cross. So as well as being visible in portraits, the possession and the use of these jewels is further evidence in court inventories, including those relating to James's court in Rome, the peripatetic court of Charles in the 1750s, and the possession of Henry in the later 18th century. And these are two examples of jewels that are known to, or at least can be traced back to the Stuart courts in Rome, and came back to the current royal collections through George IV. Apologies, I pressed N. That wasn't intended. There we go. So that's the Thistle there. Membership of the chivalric orders was extended to the Stuarts' most loyal supporters, including some of those who surrounded them in exile. Alexander Cunningham, who travelled to Rome, described Lord Dunbar as someone who became well his blue riband and star of the Garter. And another, Joseph Spence, when he described the Pretenders' party at the Opera in 1741, referred to there being some other blues and green garters around him, as a way to denote the status and possibly also the nationality of those who surrounded the exiled Stuarts. As Lindsay McGill has demonstrated, elevation to the knighthood in the chivalric orders was, from its initial conception, used as a tool for fostering and rewarding loyalty. What I find interesting here, though, is the work that the physical presence of the insignia of the orders could do for them. I've already noted that it said something about the status of those who surrounded the court and the Stuarts themselves, and the wearing of this physical insignia appears also to have substituted for ritual performances of sovereignty when they could not be conducted. On the investiture of the exiled James, Mall, Earl of Panmure, to the Knight of the Thistle at Avignon in April 1716, the Warrant Book records a decree stating that, it being apparently impossible to observe usual ceremonies, we do hereby empower you to wear all the ensigns of the said most noble and most ancient order of the Thistle, as if you had been actually elected and installed with all the ceremonies thereto unbelonging. And just finding that written really brought to life what these objects can do. In the public arena of Roman life, the Stuarts were firmly recognised and materialised as royals. This is evident when we look at the material culture of Clementina's funeral celebration in January 1735. For 17th and 18th century European monarchies, funeral ceremonies and their surrounding material and literary culture were a significant component of the cycle of events which were used to reaffirm the sovereignty of the ruling dynasty. With the assistance of the papacy, the exiled Stuarts succeeded in maintaining such ceremonial expression of their claim to sovereignty and legitimacy. There are various written and visual sources for the funeral, which gives us at least an impression of how the Romans, and the Pope in particular, wanted to celebrate the life of this exiled queen. Engraved copies of 2 paintings made by Giovanni Paolo Panini, who was commissioned to capture scenes from the funeral, depict the lying in state of Clementina in the church of the Duodici Apostoli, the 12 Apostles, which lay close to the Piazza del Re, and the procession of the corpse through the town on its way to St. Peter's Basilica to be buried. So alongside the textual records of the funeral, we can gain at least an impression of this event. And the ceremonies themselves do correspond with what we'd expect from other contemporary European monarchies, including their predecessors. So they consisted of 3 main features: the lying in state, the funeral procession itself, and the burial and obsequies for the dead. As Katrina Murray has argued with reference to the funeral of another Stuart queen, Anna of Denmark, the material culture of Clementina's funeral, quote, publicly inscribed her human form with diverse meaning. So at each stage of this event, the use of royal iconography and materials of magnificence, such as velvet, gold thread, large quantities of black cloth, these all work together to claim and proclaim her royal status, and as well the status of the court who buried her. And this engraving gives an impression of how she was laid out, with ermine trimmed, or at least this cloth that was painted to make it look like ermine, using heraldry, royal heraldry that indicated not only the royal status of Clementina, but her family lineage and the Stuart family lineage that in her children were carried on, and also banners extolling her virtues, piety, chastity, modesty. The national flags also of Scotland, England, Ireland and Poland worked to, as Katrina Murray has said for Anna's funeral, signify her lineal, maternal and transnational identities, so as queen, mother and member of 2 dynasties. So these reinforce the status of those Clementina left behind, as well as it did for herself, consolidating this royal lineage in the image of the Stuarts in Rome. So this is the funeral monument to Clementina in St. Peter's Basilica as well, which I think really affirms this royal status of hers. What about the material which emanated from the court to supporters? Medals have long served to mark significant events in the life of the exiled Stuarts and other dynasties, and they spread news amongst their supporters in Britain and Rome of special events such as marriages, births, lifetime achievement or life stage achievements, such as the princes maturing to ages 5 and 10, 15. Excuse me. The production and circulation of medals were consistent with 18th century royal practices, and they carried messages which proclaimed and reinforced titles, lineage and legitimacy of the royal family, as well as highlighting their virtues. So, for example, for the conclusion of the marriage between James and Clementina at Montefiscone in September 1719, this marriage was commemorated with a medal by one of the Hamerani brothers, the leading medalist family in Rome, who were favoured by the Stuart court and the papal court. So looking again to accounts of the court to put together the material with the documentary evidence. Hammerani was paid an estimated 450 scudi to produce at least 200 medals in silver and bronze, 50 to 100 of which went to the court itself for their own distribution to key supporters, although some of the details in that mean this is a bit of an estimate. The obverse of this medal depicts the joint bust of James and Clementina, inscribed with their royal titles, reinforcing the couple's claim to sovereignty. And the reverse depicts Hercules and Venus together, holding hands. Beside them, Aputi holds a caduceus, a symbol of the messenger of the gods, heralding the news of their marriage. The inscription dates that marriage, the 1st of September, 1719. So drawing on classical mythology, which was common within early modern royal iconography and used extensively in Stuart material and visual culture, the medal depicts James as the hero of his people, complemented, as was the expected role of the Queen, by Clementina, goddess of love and bringer of peace. One particular feature of letters between women and the exiled court was their role in acquiring portraits, medals and relics from the Stuart court on behalf of Jacobites in Britain. For example, in May 1717, Anne Oglethorpe wrote to the Earl of Mar about a picture, an original in little, for Mary Caesar, wife of an influential Tory Jacobite politician. Between 1729 and 30, we again find Anne using her influence with the exiled court to acquire portraits of the young Stuart princes on behalf of friends in England. This time she was in direct contact with James VIII, who in August 1729 took the trouble to inform her that Prince Charles was sitting for the picture that she had requested for the gentleman, who is possibly Russell, Duke of Bedford. And the Duke appears to have approached Anne and to notify the exiled king of his friendship towards the cause. Similarly, in 1734, James Edgar, secretary to the exiled court, wrote to Sister Mary Rosa Howard, an English nun at Brussels, informing her that he would send a dozen prints of the prince and as many of the duke at her request. He added that he would then take the opportunity to send 2 silver medals, one of the king and queen, other of the 2 princes, in the knowledge that they would be useful to the nun to gift to supporters. 2 years later, in December 1736, Sister Mary Rosa again wrote to her king asking for prints and relics of Clementina, having received letters from our chief families in England pressing me to get any least thing of our queens. This request she was forced to make because she had already dispersed the best part the king honoured me with in her hair to those who set a just reason up to such a great treasure. So it's noticeable that these examples show that Sister Mary Rosa had considerable control over the dispersal of Stuart material and visual culture, taking decisions on who she thought were suitable to receive portraits and relics. Fulfilling requests for portraiture was not just about propaganda, but was very much an emotional exchange. It was often a reward to loyal Jacobites. So as Anne reminded the Earl of Mar when the portrait for Mary Caesar was slow in arriving, you know there, meaning the Caesars, merit, and how useful they have been and are every day, therefore not to be neglected for so small a thing. It is notable that granting Mary Caesar's request would also reflect on her husband, if not overtly, it would also reflect on her husband, and this is a reminder that 18th century women were often partners in the political activities of their husbands, if not in overtly political ways. Anne herself received tokens from James VIII as reward for her loyalty, intended as a sign that he was not ungrateful for her services. This was not a single directional relationship of reward flowing from the monarch, however, and Jacobites were not powerless in this relationship. Gift exchange provided an opportunity for supporters to give their consent to Stuart rule. In the relationship of obligations which underpin the gift, by accepting and indeed requesting portraits from the exiled Stuarts, Jacobites willingly placed themselves in a position of indebtedness to the monarch. This gesture echoed 17th century interpretations of kingship, which Angela McShane explains relied on notions of consent in the form of freely chosen deference, which were motivated by love. So that consent came with the expectation that the monarch also had a duty to return the love. Had the Stuarts not provided portrait gifts in direct response to requests as reward for services and in the form of unsolicited but expected circulation of Stuart images, the exiled Stuarts would have broken that gift relationship and damaged the mutual obligation on which their authority and legitimacy ultimately rested. So moving away, I think, from the preoccupation with the persuasive purpose of Stuart court imagery as propaganda and understanding the circulation of Stuart portraiture in terms of relationships emphasises its role in an exchange of loyalty between the exiled monarch and the subject. Once they received these portraits, Jacobites actively engaged with them too. Mrs. Caesar could not be a moment without looking at her portrait of James VIII. And Anne spent whole mornings meditating before her miniature portraits of Charles and Henry, praying and blessing of them. These portraits might have looked something like this. So these images provided Anne with something concrete through which to enact her loyalty. Prompted by her viewing of the exiled princes in miniature, conflating these portrait objects with the living, bodily people that they represent, Anne promised that she would try all possible means to make them soon be seen in their own country. So as the subject of her letter to James, the portraits offered Anne the premise to make a declaration of allegiance directly to her monarch. So these images became props which assisted Anne's practice of loyalty and allowed her to imagine a future in which the Stuart dynasty was restored in person to British soil. By looking at a proficient likeness of the exiled Stuarts, supporters could not only get to know them, but could make them present. As Sally Holloway has argued, gazing at a portrait of a loved individual worked to, quote, animate momentarily the lifeless ink or paint before them in order to summon the absent lover. The material properties, apologies, here are some examples of prints that were also circulated. And these two portraits, printed portraits of Jacobite women, Jenny Cameron, Flora MacDonald, and this example of a Jacobite fan, I think exemplify this notion of portraiture and gazing and holding portraits as well. So the material properties of the object encourage haptic interaction with it beyond the gaze. Marcia Poynton reminds scholars of the portrait miniature's existence as an object rather than only as an image, which has a relationship to the physical body. So held in the hand, sometimes worn on the body as jewellery, sensory engagement with portrait miniatures was essential to their potency as objects at the centre of an effective relationship between the exiled Stuarts and their loyal supporters. And this is most obvious when miniature portraits are set into jewellery. Two portrait rings in the collections of National Museum Scotland are known to have belonged to Isabella Strange, who was the wife of Jacobite engraver Robert Strange, sister to the secretary of the Stuart court in Rome, Andrew Lumsden, and all-round fascinating character in her own right, I think. So the ring on the left contains a miniature portrait of Clementina, as well as a few other forms of miniature, we might say. This cipher, CR, royal cipher for Clementina Regina, and hair, which we have to assume is Clementina's hair, or we're asked to understand to be Clementina's hair. The portrait is flanked by jewels on either side, possibly garnets, and these not only embellish the ring, but they emphasise the value of the person represented. As Poynton argues, these jewels have the capacity to catch the eye, so drawing in the gaze, again, catalysing the act of looking, loving and longing. The second ring on the right, apologies for the poor quality of the photo, it contains a bust of Charles Edward Stewart. And this ring dates from the late 1740s, 50s, when the very tiny medallions were made in Paris. Isabella Strange's will informs us that she wore her ring with the miniature portrait of Prince Charles at her watch, from which we can infer that it hung by her waist, possibly from a chatelaine, an object onto which women would attach small precious objects such as watches, seals and other tokens of affection often. So if possession of miniature portraits and sometimes hair of the Stuarts was a sign and a symptom of Jacobite loyalty, these objects also assisted Jacobites in the practice and maintenance of loyal emotions. Holloway has argued that interaction with portrait miniatures and other non-portrait love tokens served not only as an outlet for existing emotion, but could be used to intensify them. So by touching and looking at the object, the user could indulge in the misery of absence, which I find is a really wonderful way to think about how we bring up these emotions in ourselves because we want to experience them. So for these Jacobite women, that feeling of longing was important to sustain in order to be a Jacobite, in order to keep that going. Wearing the ring by her watch, Isabella would be prompted, or to paraphrase Alina German, prodded to think of the prince and her love for him at various moments throughout her day when she consulted it, re-engaging with those emotions which led her to choose it in the first place. Finally, very briefly, I would like to think about the things that Jacobites, in particular Jacobite women, made in response to and as a method for dealing with Stuart exile. The material culture produced by women must be considered as a part of the process by which they shape the world around them and their place in it. Domestic needlework is one of the material practices most closely associated with women and the feminine. As Rosika Parker wrote in her seminal work on women's sewing, women use domestic needlework to contribute to wider political and cultural debates. So with it, they made meaning of their own whilst overtly living up to an oppressive stereotype. Others have also considered the rhetorical potential of women's needlework, arguing that this material practice worked to construct and circulate knowledge, inculcating commonly held values, and inviting audiences to imagine possibilities that need to be enacted in the world. As Joanna Amos and Lisa Binkley proposed, the needle must be thought of as a tool for expression, which enabled individuals and communities to remake themselves and the world around them. So I think when we're thinking about the context of Jacobite women living in post-Stuart Britain, this kind of remaking of a world through the things that they craft even in a small particular setting was one way to cope with the Stuart exile and Stuart absence. And one of the very specific and well-known examples of Jacobite needlework survives in the collection of National Museum Scotland is a set of bed valances and matching wall hangings. They were embroidered by an elite Scottish woman, Anne Urquhart, in the early 1700s. So made of wool and silk thread, embroidered into linen, the hangings are decorated with crewel work and are representative of the type of needlework that a woman of Anne's status would have customarily carried out at home. In one panel of the valances is a large sunflower with the crown cipher of the Stuart King and Queen in exile and the date 1719 in its centre. The centre of the flower itself has been embroidered using French knots, which is a very intricate and time-consuming stitch and reflects the skill and care that Anne took to make this particular piece. The iconography is, of course, a reference to Anne's devotion to the Stuarts and a celebration of the new royal marriage. And by using the sunflower, Anne revealed her knowledge of Jacobite culture in a wider sense. The sunflower had a long-standing Stuart connotation and was used by Jacobites as a symbol of fidelity throughout the later 17th and 18th century. So I like to think of this object, this piece of embroidery, rather than being a passive observational response to the news of James and Clementina's marriage, as really a way that Anne made sense of her loyalty to the Stuarts while they remained absent and exiled, in her domestic space, creating a world in which the two monarchs and their union could be celebrated and made present. And she did this through the physical labour of stitching, of making. And if for Novotny, Jacobite material culture offers a view of how contemporaries enacted loyalty and rebellion in ways other than on the battlefield, this was not only voiced through symbols on objects, but was voiced in the practice of making. So to conclude with these various and brief examples, I would love to say more about all of them. I hope that what I've shared with you today gives you an impression and has demonstrated that the material culture produced and consumed in response to Stuart exile was more than propagandistic image making on the one hand, and more than an expression of support for Jacobite cause on the other. Individuals, the Stuarts included, used material culture and material practices to construct their Jacobite selves and to shape their everyday lives within the reality of life as exiles in Rome and as subjects under Hanoverian rule in Britain. Through material culture, the court really did exist and was embodied as a royal one. And the portraits and relics disseminated from it were crucial components of a personal dialogue between the exiled monarch and their supporters. In turn, material made by Jacobites for themselves at home and sometimes even sent to the court were not only clandestine expressions of Jacobitism, but were ways of crafting a world and a self which existed in longing for a Stuart return. Less concerned with the success of these objects in inspiring support for a restoration in practical terms, I would like to acknowledge the cultural importance of the sustained emotional practices based around the production and exchange of Jacobite material culture, which underpinned loyalty to the Stuarts during the 18th century. And analysis in these terms extends the definition of what it was to be Jacobite and to act loyally. At both ends of the spectrum, for the Stuarts and their supporters, material culture offered a way to maintain a sense of honour in who they were without having to achieve a restoration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgia. That was excellent. A really wonderful tour of a number of excellent objects, and also different facets of Jacobitism and that idea of loyal exchange, which I really like. That's fantastic. And thank you for introducing many of us to some of the collections from the NMS as well, which is great. It's great to see what is held in terms of some of the Jacobite material that's there, which is great. I have loads of questions that I could ask, but I don't want to dominate, so I'm going to open the floor up. So if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to use the chat function, or you can come in via mic. If you can put your hand up, just so that I can see who wants to come in first. Otherwise, just unmute and we'll sort of work around. As no one's jumped immediately on it, I will give people some thinking time, and I'll ask one of the questions that I was thinking about, which was in relation to the distribution of medals and miniatures and things like that. And it got me thinking about the pieces as kind of almost collector's items. And I wondered if there was much evidence of people who weren't Jacobites actually getting a hold of these sorts of objects just to have them. And particularly in the period of active Jacobitism, sort of, I can see it much more likely later on in the period when that threat of prosecution has lessened. But because they are sort of treasonous objects, I wonder if there is any evidence of them being collected by people just so that they have them.
Nicola, that's such a good question. I don't know. It's not something I've looked into. But there are what appear to be sort of collections of Jacobite medals, and I actually wouldn't be surprised if people did acquire them for that kind of interest of what was going on in the world. And the idea that people were either Jacobite or Hanoverian, I think, is too simplistic, and there's certainly room for interest in both, even if you don't necessarily support one way or the other. But that's something to look up. Yeah.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I can definitely see it later on when that kind of threat's gone. But yeah, it'd be fascinating to know if people sort of take that risk.
Yeah, you might say the same for portrait prints as well, actually, and miniature portraits and things. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. So, any questions from the floor more broadly? I'm just seeing one come in the chat there. So why do you think that women use the emotional and longing way to express Jacobitism rather than men? Is it because of the lack of political standing that women had at the time? Yeah,
this is something I've been grappling with, because I don't want to suggest that a woman only responded to this in an emotional way. Of course, there were women who were exchanging letters and were involved in materially supporting the efforts of Jacobites, but partly I've emphasized women because of my interest, and they also, I think, women are expected in the 18th century in some ways to take up that role, at least in a more public way, by requesting these objects. It's something that would be expected of them. Also, not just in terms of the monarchy, but if there was a death or a birth, we see that women are more involved in this material exchange. I didn't really look at men and their emotional responses, but men did collect portraits and miniatures and rings. So there's other jewellery in the collection which is known to have belonged to men, including Andrew Lumsden. And the ring that I showed you of Clementina, the Duke of Beaufort, when he went to Rome in 1725, he came home with a miniature portrait ring of Clementina. So it's not exclusive to them, but I wanted to think about how women engage emotionally in the context of their wider work that they produce as elite women in the 18th century. But certainly that's a way, it's possibly for us as historians, a way into understanding their Jacobitism, because they don't have necessarily the same political activity as men.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Georgia. And thank you, Kat, as well, for the question. Any other questions for Georgia?
Sorry, I'm not quite keeping up with them.
I'm just seeing another one come in the chat there. Do we know where the most Jacobite material was produced? Did the producers typically cover their endeavours by acting as different businesses? So where was there that idea of sort of covering their tracks in it?
Yeah, so again, the producers, so the court produced material, you might say that's where the majority of this is known to have been produced, because we know that the Hamerani family throughout the 18th century were producing the medals, and you have numerous artists, portrait artists working for the Stuarts in Rome, and then copies in being produced in Paris. People like Robert Strange, we know, producing prints, and then things like fans and ceramics. A lot of that is being produced in the commercial hubs where those types of objects would normally be produced. We have quite a lot of Staffordshire ware, which is painted with Jacobite iconography on it, for example. And the reality is that we don't really know who made them. They're not overtly being advertised. But again, it's not a line of research that I went into myself in detail. So that's sort of relying on what others have said. So in that sense, they're covering their tracks with anonymity. And like makers as well, you know, it's commercial. You find printmakers. John Faber comes to mind, who has produced portraits of the Stuarts, of Clementina in particular, but was also producing portraits of the Hanoverian family. So whatever was going to bring in some money for them, possibly. Yeah, I hope that helps your question. And Darren, I just saw that you suggested that provenance in terms of collections of Jacobite objects might come in Jacobite antiquarian exhibitions. Certainly, that would be a great source.
Thanks very much. Norman?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, it was very interesting, thank you. I was just wondering if there's any comparative work has been done with other exiles from other parts of Europe, other royal houses. I mean, some European capitals must have been awash with all sorts of exiles from all over the place. So how do the Jacobites fit in to that? Were they behaving differently, or were they all part of the same exile cultures?
I think as exiles, they are behaving in similar ways. This effort to maintain a royal court, to maintain it materially and in the activities that they're undertaking, and to maintain connections with home are key themes. And there is a really good edited volume on monarchy and exile in which the Stuarts are included. Forgive me, I can't remember, I'm not one for remembering titles properly or editors, but Monarchy and Exile brings the Stuarts into that context. But I think there's probably a bit more actually focused work that could be done in that sense. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
was just having a look behind me because I'm pretty sure it's on the bookshelf there, but I can't quite reach it. But I'll have a look and see, and I can put the details.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we've got time probably for one more. Oh, Sarah, yeah.
Well, I was just going to point out that maintaining your connection with home, in Clementina's funeral engraving, the thing that dominates there is the crown. And the crown does not die. She's died.
Yes.
But they are the crown, and the crown is them, and the crown is British. And that is an absolute reading across from her death in Rome to London, as far as I read it.
Yeah, certainly. And actually just bringing it to the present, having studied Clementina's funeral a bit, then watching the recent the death of the Queen here and the funeral, I noticed how quickly we went from death of the Queen, long live King Charles. This transition went so smoothly. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I mean, we have probably got time for one last question if we've got a short one from anyone. I noticed Darren's put the name of that book, the edited collection, into the chat. So thank you very much for that. I couldn't quite see it from where I was sitting.
For Jacobite Exiles, other consideration, I mentioned this nun, Sister Mary Rosa Howard, and Catholic exiles in general. I think the Stuarts fit into that, into English Catholics exile community in particular. And there's some great literature on that we can look at.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Georgia. That was absolutely wonderful. Really, really excellent talk. And thank you all for coming along. Our next talk in the History Talks live series will be on Thursday, the 15th of December at the slightly later time of 7 o'clock. So take note of that for those of you who come regularly. We'll be welcoming Dr. Emily Ward, who's going to be giving a talk entitled An Adolescent in Service to a Knight, Adolescence and Aspects of Belonging circa 1050 to 1250. So another really interesting talk to come. I think what we'll do now is just thank Georgia once again for a really excellent talk, and we'll wrap up there. Thanks very much.